The candle was still burning when Ruth Yates finally understood what it meant. She stood in the doorway of the small room she had been given in the Fletcher household, her traveling bag still clutched against her chest, her knuckles white around the worn leather handles. The flame sat on the windowsill in a tin holder, small and deliberate, casting a warm circle of gold across the rough-hewn floorboards. Outside, the New Mexico Territory night was absolute and cold, the kind of darkness that swallowed a person whole. And yet someone had placed that candle there, burning, waiting, as if they had known she would be afraid of the dark. She had not told anyone she was afraid of the dark. She had not told anyone anything, really. She had arrived on the afternoon stage from Santa Fe with a single bag, a letter of employment, and a silence so deep it had become a kind of armor. Ruth Yates, 26 years old, former schoolteacher, formerly of Abilene, Kansas, formerly of a life that no longer existed. She had taken the position as housekeeper for Alfred Fletcher, widower, rancher, father of 4, because there was nowhere else left for her to go. She had not expected the candle. She had not expected to stand here in the dark with something sharp and terrifying cracking open behind her sternum, because a small act of anonymous kindness had undone 3 years of careful numbness faster than a pistol shot. She blew the candle out. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself everything meant nothing, because that was the only way she had learned to survive. She was wrong about both, but she would not know that yet for quite some time. It had begun 6 months earlier, in a lawyer's office in Abilene, with the kind of quiet devastation that leaves no visible wound. Ruth had sat in a straight-back chair across from a man named Holloway who smelled of tobacco and mild indifference, while he read aloud from a document she had already memorized. Her husband, Thomas Yates, had died of a fever in February of 1883. He had been 31 years old. He had also, it turned out, been carrying debts of a size that swallowed everything they owned. The house, the furniture, the small piano she had learned to play as a girl. The teaching position at the Abilene school had been terminated 2 weeks prior, as the school board had decided, with very little discussion, that a woman of uncertain financial circumstance was not a suitable model for their children. This was not stated directly. It was suggested gently by men who would not meet her eyes. Ruth had thanked them. She had thanked the lawyer. She had walked out into the February cold and stood on the wooden sidewalk and looked at a street she had lived on for 4 years and felt absolutely nothing. The nothing had lasted for a while, long enough that she had begun to suspect it was permanent. She had moved into a boarding house. She had taken in mending. She had written letters to schools in other towns, careful, qualified, professional letters that came back with polite refusals or no response at all. A widow with no references, no current school position, no male family to vouch for her character. In 1883, in the Western Territories, that was very nearly a non-person. It was Mrs. Carroll at the boarding house who had shown her the advertisement. Alfred Fletcher, it read, of Cielo Rojo Ranch, outside Mesilla, New Mexico Territory, seeks experienced housekeeper, capable woman, steady character required. 4 children, ages 7 through 15. Previous experience with household management preferred. Compensation includes room, board, and monthly wage of $12. Sounds respectable enough, Mrs. Carroll had said, meaning it sounded like survival. Ruth had written her letter that same evening. She had kept it precise and factual, listing her experience managing a household, her history as a schoolteacher, her capacity for organization and routine. She had not mentioned Thomas. She had not mentioned Abilene. She had said only that she was available immediately and was prepared to work hard. Alfred Fletcher had responded within the week. His letter was brief to the point of curtness. Position available. Stage arrives Tuesday. Someone will meet you. Someone turned out to be a boy of about 12, freckled, with his father's dark eyes and a horse too large for him that he managed with cheerful competence. He had introduced himself as Daniel Fletcher and had not stopped talking for the entire 40-minute ride from Mesilla to the ranch. "Pa doesn't talk much," Daniel had told her, as a kind of warning or a gift. He used to before Mama died, but that was 2 years ago. He's still in there somewhere, though. James says he's just quiet now. James is my oldest brother. Then there's me, then there's Clara, and then there's Henry. Henry's the baby, he's 7. Clara doesn't like strangers, but she'll get used to you probably. Henry cries sometimes at night, but not like he used to. Ruth had listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap, watching the desert landscape open up around her, the mesquite and the red dirt and the impossible distance of the sky. "And your father?" she had asked. "What is he like?" Daniel had thought about it with the seriousness of a boy who took questions seriously. "Honest," he said finally. "He's real honest, sometimes too honest. Mama used to say he had no gift for comfortable lies." He paused. She had enough for both of them. Ruth had not known what to do with that, so she had simply watched the land and let it pass. The ranch, Cielo Rojo, was larger than she had imagined. The main house was solid adobe and timber, 2 stories, with a wide covered porch that faced west toward the mountains. There were outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse where 3 hired hands lived, a smokehouse, a root cellar, and a kitchen garden that had clearly been allowed to go somewhat wild. The whole operation had the feeling of a place that was being held together by determination alone, with the seams beginning to show. Alfred Fletcher had been standing on the porch when they arrived, and Ruth's first clear sight of him had been a man in his mid-30s, with the kind of face that had been lived in hard. Not unpleasant. Actually, she would think later, quite striking in the way that landscape was striking, all strong angles and weathered surfaces and a quality of permanence that was almost stubborn. His hair was dark with threads of early gray at the temples. His hands, she noticed, because she always noticed hands, were the hands of a man who worked. His eyes, when he looked at her, were the color of winter sky, gray-blue and measuring. "Miss Yates," he said. "Mrs. Yates," she corrected automatically, and then wished she hadn't, because it cost something to say it and she hadn't been prepared to spend that. "Mrs. Yates," he said, without missing a beat or offering condolences she didn't want. "The house is yours to manage as you see fit. Breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 6. The children have chores that they do without complaint. If they give you trouble, you come to me." He paused. "They won't give you trouble." "I can manage children," she said. "I don't doubt it." Something moved in his face, brief and almost imperceptible. "Welcome to Cielo Rojo." He had then stepped off the porch and walked toward the barn without another word, and Daniel had looked at Ruth with an expression of cheerful apology. "I told you," the boy said. "Honest. No gift for comfortable things." What she had not expected, stepping into that house for the first time, was that it would feel like something. She had stopped feeling things with any reliability after Thomas died, after the slow drain of grief and humiliation and careful survival. The house was not elegant or fancy. It smelled of wood smoke and old leather and something that might have been dried herbs. The furniture was plain and worn with use. There were books on a shelf that surprised her, a rifle above the fireplace that did not. A pair of small women's gloves on a hook near the kitchen door that clearly no one had yet been able to move. And Ruth looked at them once and then looked away and never mentioned them again. The children materialized gradually, as children do. James, the eldest at 15, was composed and watchful in the way of oldest children who have taken on weight too early. He was polite to Ruth with a formality that kept her at arm's length, and she respected it. Clara, 12, was dark-eyed and wary, with her mother's gloves and her mother's memory clearly still wrapped around her in ways that made her prickly as a cactus and twice as sharp. Daniel, 11, she already knew and liked. He was a boy made entirely of curiosity and forward motion. And then there was Henry. Henry was 7 years old, with his father's gray-blue eyes and a solemnity that sat oddly on a child's face. He had stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Ruth with an expression she could not immediately name, and then he had said very quietly, "Are you going to stay?" She had not known how to answer that honestly. "I intend to," she said. He had nodded, as if cataloging this information for future reference, and gone back upstairs without another word. She would think about that moment many times in the weeks that followed. She settled into the household's rhythms the way she settled into most things, systematically and without fanfare. She rose before dawn, had the stove going and coffee ready before Alfred came in from his first check of the stock, had breakfast on the table when the children came down. She organized the kitchen garden, identified what had been let go and what could be salvaged. She mended. She cleaned. She cooked 3 meals a day with the kind of steady competence that required no praise and received very little. She discovered that Clara had been trying to manage the household herself since her mother's death, a 12-year-old shouldering a woman's burden with insufficient tools and too much pride, and Ruth dismantled this situation with extreme care, making sure Clara felt helped rather than displaced. She helped James with the accounts, because she had always been good with numbers, and she could see the strain in his face when he tried to make the columns balance. She let Daniel follow her around and tell her things, because she was good at listening, and he clearly needed someone to listen. She read to Henry in the evenings, because he asked once, tentatively, and she said yes, and after that he appeared at the sitting room door every evening at 7:30 with a book under his arm, and the look of a person who had decided to trust something. Alfred Fletcher she saw every day and spoke to perhaps a combined total of 20 minutes. He was not rude. He was not unkind. He was contained in a way that she recognized, because she was contained in exactly the same way, and when two people are both made of walls, they tend to navigate around each other very efficiently. She noticed things about him, because she was observant and she could not help it. She noticed that he always checked the livestock twice before coming in at night, even when one of the hands had already done it, as if he trusted the animal's safety only to himself. She noticed that he read in the evenings by lamplight, serious books, history and land management, and occasionally, to her surprise, poetry. She noticed that he was careful with the children in a way that was slightly awkward, as if the tenderness he felt for them was something he was still learning to express through the medium of action rather than words. He fixed things they needed fixed. He showed up at the exact right moments. He did not say, "I love you," probably, but he said, "Here is your horse, properly shod, and here is your coat. You left it on the fence." And then there was the candle. It happened for the first time on the 3rd night she was there. She had retired to her room after supper, after the children were settled and the kitchen was clean, with the kind of bone-deep weariness that had become her constant companion. Her room was at the end of the hall on the ground floor, small and adequate, with a window that faced the open desert. The first night and second night, the darkness beyond that window had been total, the kind of darkness that had nothing in it to hold on to, and she had lain awake both nights with her eyes open and her heart doing something irregular in her chest. She had not told anyone this. She had not told anyone anything about Thomas or Abilene or the particular texture of her grief, which was not clean sorrow, but rather a complicated knot of loss and guilt, and something she was not prepared to examine directly. Thomas had not been a cruel man. He had not been a good man exactly. He had been a man she had married at 22 because it was what you did, and they had been reasonably comfortable together for 4 years, and then he had died and left her with nothing, and the grief and the anger and the relief, which she hated herself for feeling, had all compressed together into something she kept in a very locked room inside herself. The night of the 3rd day, she came to her room to find a candle burning on the windowsill. She had stood there for a long time, not understanding. She checked the hall, no one there. She listened to the house, quiet, settling into its nighttime sounds. She had finally blown the candle out and told herself it was probably one of the children, though she could not think of a logical reason. The 4th night, another candle, same tin holder, same careful placement on the windowsill so the flame would catch the last of the desert light. She had stood there again, same feeling in her chest, that sharp crack, that alarming warmth, and she had again blown it out and said nothing. The fifth night she determined to watch. She had dinner done, and the children headed to bed by 8, and she had gone to her room and sat in the dark at the edge of her bed with her door cracked open and waited. She heard Henry's footsteps first, soft and deliberate, coming down the stairs with the particular care of a child trying not to be heard. She heard him come along the hall. She heard the small sound of the tin holder being set on the windowsill, and then the scratch of a match, and then a tiny pause in which she imagined him watching the flame catch, making sure. Then his footsteps going back down the hall, up the stairs, back to his room. Henry, 7 years old. Alfred Fletcher's youngest had been leaving her a candle each night, without being asked, without being thanked, without any indication that he expected either. He had simply decided, in whatever quiet interior process governed him, that she needed it. She had sat in the dark with that burning candle for a very long time. She had not said anything, not to Henry, not to anyone. She did not know how to receive kindness that cost nothing to the giver except attention. She did not know how to acknowledge that a 7-year-old had seen through every wall she had built and identified, with perfect accuracy, one of the things she needed most. She was afraid that if she said anything it would stop, and she was more afraid of what it meant that she needed it not to stop. So she said nothing. She let the candle burn. And every night Henry left it, quietly and without acknowledgement, and every night she sat with the small circle of warmth it made in the dark. And it was, though she would not have named it yet, the first thing that had felt like grace in 3 years. October deepened into November. The desert cold came in earnest, biting and clear, and Ruth added a second wool blanket to the children's beds and put extra wood by each fireplace, and made a chilly stew that kept well and warmed a person from the inside out. The kitchen garden was done for the season, but she spent several afternoons preserving what was left, filling jars with tomatoes and dried beans, and the wild herbs she'd gathered along the creek bed. The pantry began to look like a pantry again rather than an apology. Clara stopped being wary of her around the 4th week. It happened over a dress. Clara had been invited to a social at the schoolhouse in Mesilla, a holiday event, and she had come to breakfast one morning with her mother's old blue dress half pinned to her, too long and too wide in the shoulders, her jaw set in a way that said she was going to figure this out or die trying. Ruth had looked at her for a moment and then said, "Sit down after breakfast and let me see what needs doing." Clara had sat very still while Ruth measured and pinned and cut, and neither of them had said anything about whose dress it had been or what it meant that it was being altered to fit someone else now. When it was done and Clara stood in front of the small mirror in the hallway in a dress that now fit her properly, something had moved across the girl's face that was very close to grief and very close to gratitude, and she had said quietly, "Thank you, Mrs. Yates." "You'll look fine," Ruth said. "You already do." Clara had gone to her room. She had come back 15 minutes later and silently put a small autumn wildflower, picked from somewhere in the yard, on the kitchen windowsill where Ruth was working. She had not said anything either. They were well matched in that way. James remained the most careful with her. He was the one who remembered his mother most clearly, she thought, and who had the most complicated feelings about the idea of the household running again, of meals being good, and the house being warm and life resuming its shape. She did not push him. She let him come at his own pace. What she did was talk to him about the ranch accounts, ask his opinion, include him in decisions the way someone would include a person of consequence, because at 15, he was doing the work of a man, and no one had acknowledged that with enough regularity. One afternoon in November she found him at the desk in the small office off the main room, bent over a ledger with a pencil, and she brought him a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one and set it down by his elbow. He looked at it. Then at her. "The Fletcher side account in Santa Fe," she said. "The interest rate is 3/4 of a point higher than the one in Mesilla. I noticed it in last month's statements." If you consolidated at the Mesilla Bank, you'd save about $40 over the year. He stared at her. How do you know about banking rates? I ran a household for 4 years on a very limited budget, she said. You learn to watch the details. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her with an expression that was very slowly recalibrating. I'll talk to Pa about it, he said. Good, she said, and left him to it. She did not hear the conversation James had with his father that evening. But the next morning, Alfred Fletcher appeared in the kitchen doorway while she was making breakfast. She heard him come in and felt the shift in the room's atmosphere that always accompanied him, a kind of density, as if he occupied space more deliberately than other people. James tells me you caught something in the banking accounts. She kept her eyes on the skillet. Just a rate discrepancy. Not uncommon. $40 is significant, he said. I'd have said something sooner, but I wanted to be sure of my reading. A pause. She could feel him looking at her in that careful way he had, measuring and quiet. Thank you, he said. It's what I'm here for. Another pause longer. She was starting to understand that his silences were not empty. They were full of things he was working out how to say, or deciding whether to say, or concluding that he wouldn't say but filing carefully away. Mrs. Yates. His voice was lower, more deliberate. She turned then because something in his tone required it. He was looking at her steadily, that winter sky gaze with something in it she couldn't immediately name. Are you well here? He asked. The work isn't too much. It was such a simple question. Careful, slightly stiff, completely sincere. She felt something tighten in her throat. I'm well, she said. The work suits me. He nodded once, the way he received most information, as if logging it somewhere. Good, he said. And then he took his coffee and went to the morning's work. She stood at the stove for a moment longer than necessary, and realized her hands had gone slightly unsteady, and was annoyed with herself about it. December brought the first real cold, and with it a crisis that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with a man named Gerald Holt. She had not known about Holt before he appeared at the ranch one Thursday morning, riding in with 2 companions and the kind of easy confidence that belonged to men who were accustomed to getting what they wanted. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed by frontier standards, with a neat silver mustache and eyes that calculated things quickly. He asked for Alfred Fletcher by name and was told Alfred was out on the South Range. He then looked at Ruth, who had come to the door at the sound of horses, with a particular kind of assessment that she recognized and disliked intensely. You the housekeeper? He asked. I am, she said. Holt, Gerald Holt. I have some business with Fletcher. I'll wait. She showed him to the porch and offered coffee, because that was what you did, and went inside to send Daniel to find his father. And then she listened through the open kitchen window as Holt and his companions spoke among themselves in voices they did not bother to lower. He's stretched thin, one of the companions said. I've seen the accounts. He'll sell, Holt said. They always do when the numbers stop working, 6 months, maybe 8. And if he doesn't want to sell, there are ways to make a man's numbers stop working faster, Holt said and chuckled, and she stopped listening because the cold in her chest had nothing to do with December. Alfred arrived within the half hour, and she watched from the kitchen doorway as he met Holt on the porch with the kind of contained stillness that could read as courtesy or warning depending on how perceptive you were. Holt, she suspected, was perceptive enough to know which it was. The conversation was short. She caught fragments, an offer for the land. Alfred's voice flat and final, not for sale. Holt's voice, pleasant as a knife being polished. Everything has a price, Fletcher. Alfred again, not this land. Holt left with his companions and his silver mustache and his calculating eyes, and Alfred stood on the porch for a moment after they rode out. Ruth stepped back from the kitchen doorway and busied herself with the dinner preparations, but she heard him come inside and stop in the kitchen doorway. You heard that, he said. It wasn't a question. Some of it, she said honestly. He came into the kitchen properly and sat down at the table, which was the first time he had sat in the kitchen while she was working, and she noted this without making a thing of it. Holt's been after this land for 3 years, he said. He wants to consolidate the whole valley. He's bought out 4 ranches already. But not this one. Not this one. She brought him a cup of coffee without asking and set it in front of him, and he looked at it in that way he had, as if simple gestures required interpretation. He said something about your numbers, she said carefully. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He has friends at the bank in Santa Fe. The account with the higher interest rate, she said. He looked at her sharply. If you consolidated at Mesilla as James suggested, you remove 1 point of vulnerability, she said. And if I may look at the full accounts, I may be able to find others. He was very still for a moment. You're talking about strategy, he said. I'm talking about arithmetic, she said. The strategy is yours. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but in the territory of one, some small territory of warmth that hadn't been there a moment before. All right, he said. After supper, if you're willing. I'm willing, she said. They sat at the desk in the office that evening, after the children were in bed, with the lamp turned up and the ledger books open between them. It was the first time she had been in a small space with him for more than a few minutes, and she was acutely aware of him in a way she had been carefully not being aware of him for weeks. He smelled of cold air and horses and wood smoke, and he had a habit of rubbing his thumb along his jaw when he was thinking that she found, to her own slight alarm, enormously distracting. She focused on the numbers. She had been good with numbers since childhood. Her father, a careful man of modest means, had taught her to keep accounts before she learned to bake bread, believing, in his quiet revolutionary way, that a woman who could read a ledger could not be entirely at anyone's mercy. She had not in the end been wrong that Abilene could put her at someone's mercy in other ways, but the numbers had always been solid ground. She found 3 things in Alfred's accounts over the course of 2 hours. The rate discrepancy James had already noted. An irregular fee pattern from the Santa Fe account that she suspected was being quietly inflated by someone with Holt's interest. And an outstanding land claim dispute in the northeast corner of the property that, if it went against Alfred, would slice off a significant piece of grazing land. She laid all 3 out for him methodically, with the relevant pages bookmarked and the figures noted clearly. He listened to everything she said with complete attention, the kind of listening that meant he was not waiting for her to finish so he could respond but was actually absorbing each piece. When she was done, there was a silence. How did you learn to read accounts like this? He asked. My father, she said. He thought financial literacy was more useful than most things. He was right. A pause. Your husband didn't manage his own accounts. She went very still. It was a fair question given what she just told him, and she recognized it as a reasonable observation rather than an intrusion, but it landed in a tender place. He did, she said carefully. Not well. Alfred looked at her for a moment. His expression was not prying. It was careful in the way he was always careful, reading a situation before he moved in it. I'm sorry, he said, for what you lost. The directness of it, the simple, honest gravity of it, undid her slightly. Most people offered condolences as a formula. He said it as if he had considered it and found it true. Thank you, she said, and meant it with a sincerity she hadn't expected. I know what it is, he said quietly, to have someone gone from a house, to keep looking for them in the spaces where they used to be. He was not looking at her when he said this. He was looking at the ledger, but his eyes were somewhere else entirely, and she understood that he was talking about his wife, and she felt the peculiar intimacy of 2 people acknowledging grief without performing it. Yes, she said. That is exactly what it is. They looked at the ledger together for a moment in a silence that was no longer empty. I'll contact the Mesilla Bank tomorrow, he said finally. And I know a lawyer in Las Cruces who can look at the land claim. Good, she said. He closed the ledger. She straightened her notes. They were both being very practical, both holding themselves at a careful distance, and she was aware of this and she suspected he was aware of it too, and neither of them acknowledged it. She went to bed that night and found Henry's candle burning on the windowsill, steady and small, and she sat on the edge of her bed, and looked at it for a long time and thought about the way Alfred Fletcher had said, "I know what it is," with such plain, exact honesty, and felt something begin to move in her that had been completely still for 3 years. She did not blow the candle out for a long time. Christmas came to Cielo Rojo with the particular quality of holidays that are being reconstructed after loss, tender and deliberate and slightly fragile. Ruth had not intended to do very much about it. She had not been thinking of herself as someone who shaped the household's traditions, merely someone who managed its daily functioning. But she found herself, 2 weeks before Christmas, going through the kitchen stores with a different kind of attention, calculating what was available for something more than ordinary fare. It was Daniel who mentioned that the previous Christmas had been sparse. He said it casually, the way he said most things, with cheerful information and no apparent design, but she heard what was underneath it, what they all carried, the Christmas of the first year without their mother, which had been barely a Christmas at all. She spoke to Alfred about a budget for some additional supplies, stated plainly as a practical matter. He looked at her for a moment and said, "Whatever you need." She spent the better part of a week on it. She organized the children into helping, which was partly practical and partly because she could see that they needed something to do with the holiday, needed to be engaged in the making of it rather than simply enduring its arrival. Clara turned out to have a remarkable talent for pastry. Daniel was an enthusiastic if somewhat chaotic helper. Henry, serious and methodical as always, was put in charge of the nuts and dried fruit for the pudding, a responsibility he fulfilled with the gravity of a surgeon. She ordered a small pine cut from the canyon and helped the children decorate it with paper chains and dried orange slices and a tin star that she found in a box in the storeroom, tarnished but intact. Alfred came in from the cold one afternoon to find the sitting room transformed, the tree in the corner and the smell of cinnamon and pine, and the sound of his 4 children arguing cheerfully about the proper placement of the paper chains, and he stopped in the doorway. Ruth was on a ladder, and she looked down at him, and he was looking at his children with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something unguarded and full, something that was not quite recovered grief and not quite joy but lived in the space between them. He felt her watching and looked up. She looked away first, back to the task of hanging the last paper chain, and when she came down from the ladder he had joined his children at the tree and was listening to Daniel explain, with elaborate gestures, why the star needed to be at a very specific angle. "At a very specific angle," Alfred said, without inflection. "Exactly," Daniel said. "It's a matter of trigonometry. You know what trigonometry is?" "I know that word means math stuff," Daniel said cheerfully, "and Mrs. Yates has been teaching me that math stuff matters." Alfred glanced at her across the room, a quick, quiet look. She was putting away the ladder, and she met it briefly and then looked away, but not before she saw the corner of his mouth move in a way that was unmistakably the closest he had yet come to an actual smile in her presence. She went to the kitchen to stir the pudding and told herself firmly that she was not grinning. She was, slightly. Christmas itself was the best day she had spent in 3 years. There was no dramatic reason for this, no event of particular magnitude. It was simply a day in which the house was warm and full of food, and the children were bright-eyed, and Alfred Fletcher sat at the head of the table and carved the roast with the careful precision he brought to everything. And when Ruth passed him the gravy he said, very quietly so that only she could hear, "This is the first real Christmas this house has had in 2 years, Mrs. Yates." She had looked at him and said nothing, because sometimes there was no answer to truth except to receive it. "Thank you," he said. Still quiet, still only for her. She had thought in that moment that if she were not careful something was going to happen to all her very carefully maintained nothing. She had been right. The nothing was already gone. She had simply not been paying close enough attention. January arrived with a letter from Holt's attorney, which Alfred showed her without being asked, and which confirmed her suspicion about the irregular bank fees, now formalized into what was essentially a legal threat. The land claim in the northeast corner had also been activated by someone with Holt's backing. He was moving on multiple fronts at once, trying to make the financial and legal pressure inescapable. Alfred laid the letters on the desk between them and looked at her with a gaze that was very steady and absolutely unsettled underneath. "I've dealt with difficult things before," he said, "but this is coming at angles I'm not fully equipped to handle." "The lawyer in Las Cruces," she said. "Have you written him?" "Yes, he'll come in 2 weeks, but the bank situation is more immediate." She had spent the previous night thinking about this, because once she started thinking about a problem she found it difficult to stop. "There's a cattlemen's association in Las Cruces," she said. "If Holt is trying to consolidate the valley, he's a threat to every independent rancher here, not just you. A coordinated legal response would be much harder for him to manage than individual actions." Alfred looked at her for a long moment. "You thought about this last night," he said. "I think about most things at night," she said. "I don't sleep particularly well." Something in his expression responded to that, something that was not quite pity, more like recognition. "Neither do I. The ranchers who have sold to Holt," she continued. "Do any of them regret it? Has there been any suggestion of duress in how he approached them?" "The Mendoza family," he said slowly. "Over on the east side of the valley. Rodrigo Mendoza told me once that Holt had made it very clear the offer would get worse if he waited. That's not a normal negotiation posture. It could be interpreted as coercion depending on what exactly was said and by whom," she said, "which your Las Cruces lawyer would know better than I would." He was leaning forward now, forearms on the desk, looking at her with an expression she was starting to identify as the one he wore when he was genuinely engaged with something. "How do you know about legal standards for coercion?" "Thomas's debts involved some legally questionable practices by the men he owed money to," she said. It came out more evenly than she expected. "I learned the relevant terminology. It didn't help me in the end because I had no means to pursue it, but the knowledge stayed." A pause. He was looking at her differently now, and she felt it. "They cheated him," he said carefully. "They were careful enough that it couldn't be proved," she said. "They were also careful about picking someone without resources to fight back." The muscles in his jaw had tightened visibly. "That is," he said with controlled precision, "deeply unjust." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." Another moment in which they looked at each other across the desk, across the ledgers and the letters and everything that had not been said, and she felt the air between them change in that particular way it had been changing more and more frequently, going dense and still with something neither of them was yet naming. He cleared his throat, looked at the papers. "I'll write to the Cattlemen's Association," he said. "I can draft the letter if you like," she said. "I have clearer experience with the relevant language." He looked up again, and there was something in his expression that was not quite amusement and not quite warmth but was very close to both, something that lived in the same territory as the smile he hadn't quite given her yet. "Mrs. Yates," he said, "I hired you to manage my household." "Yes. You have also apparently reorganized my finances, identified a campaign of legal harassment, and are now proposing to conduct my correspondence." "I identified things in your books," she said precisely. "You can write your own letters, but yours would be better." "Probably," she agreed, and he did smile then, an actual complete smile, brief and a little rusty, as if it hadn't been used much but absolutely genuine, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest like a stone thrown into still water, rings going outward and outward from the point of impact. She looked down at the papers. "I'll have a draft by morning," she said, very steadily. He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said, and he was not talking about the letter. She knew that. He knew she knew. Neither of them said so. February was when the hidden danger of Gerald Holt became direct. She had been in town in Mesilla, collecting supplies, accompanied by Daniel, who made every errand into an adventure. She was coming out of the dry goods store with a sack of flour balanced against her hip when one of Holt's men stepped in front of her on the sidewalk. Not Holt himself. A younger man, thick through the chest, with flat eyes and the kind of smile that was not a smile. "You the Fletcher housekeeper," he said. "I am," she said, keeping her voice level, shifting the flower to see the street more clearly around him. Mr. Holt wondered if you might pass a message to Fletcher. Mr. Fletcher can receive Mr. Holt's messages through his attorney, she said. The man's smile widened. This is more of a personal message. We know about the letters. We know about the cattlemen's meeting Fletcher's arranged for March. We know about the Mendoza testimony. Mr. Holt wants Fletcher to understand that a man with 4 children ought to think very carefully about which fights he picks. The cold that went through her then had nothing to do with the February air. I'll tell him you stopped me, she said. But I'd suggest you speak to his attorney. She moved past him with the flower and walked to the wagon where Daniel was untying the horse, and she made her voice entirely ordinary when she told him to get up. They were heading back. She did not look behind her. She told Alfred that evening, precisely and completely, because he needed to know, and because she was not going to soften a threat by delivering half of it. He listened to every word without interrupting. When she finished, the stillness around him had a different quality than his usual stillness. It was the stillness of something that had been pushed to a point where it was deciding whether to stay contained. He threatened my children, Alfred said. It was not a question or an exclamation. It was a statement made in a very quiet voice, and she found it in its particular controlled intensity more frightening than shouting would have been. He implied that you should consider them, she said carefully. That is a threat. He stood, moved to the window, stood there with his back to her for a moment. Alfred, she had not used his given name before. She hadn't planned to. It came out without her permission. He turned at it. This changes nothing, she said, meaning the legal strategy. It actually strengthens the case. If Holt is willing to approach your employee in a public street to deliver veiled threats, he is more desperate than we thought. Desperate men make mistakes. Your attorney needs to know this immediately. He looked at her across the room. In the lamplight his face was very clear, all that landscape of feeling that lived under his surface, the anger and the protectiveness and something else, something that was looking at her with a quality she wasn't quite ready to name but couldn't any longer pretend she didn't see. You said we, he said. She registered it. Your attorney, she corrected. You said we, he said again quietly, not correcting, noting, holding it. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked at the lamp. I'll write to him tonight if you'll give me his address, she said. Alfred was quiet for several seconds. His name is Prescott, Nathan Prescott. His office is on the plaza in Las Cruces. He paused. Ruth, her name, her first name, she had not heard it from him before. Yes, she said. I'm grateful, he said, for more than I know how to say. She looked at him. He was entirely sincere, entirely earnest, entirely himself, and she felt it go all the way through her, that sincerity like water finding the cracks in stone. You don't need to say all of it, she said. I can hear it. They looked at each other for a long moment across the lamplight, and then she went to write the letter, and he stayed at the window, and neither of them mentioned it again that night. But something had changed irrevocably between them. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself but is undeniably present when you check. Henry left her candle that night as he did every night, and she sat with it longer than usual. And she realized with a kind of terrified wonder, not afraid of the dark anymore. She was not sure exactly when it had happened. She sat with that understanding for a while, and then she blew the candle out and lay in the dark, and it was fine. The cattlemen's meeting in March was, by any measure, a success. Ruth had not attended because it would have been unusual for the housekeeper to attend, but she had helped Alfred prepare for it over the course of 2 weeks, helping him articulate the case clearly, organize the evidence, anticipate the counterarguments that Holt's sympathizers in the group might raise. They had sat at the desk for several evenings in a row, and she had watched him become more himself, more certain, more capable in the management of complex social and legal arguments, not because she was directing him, but because having someone listen well and push back intelligently had given him the space to find it. He came home from the meeting with more color in his face than she had seen since she arrived, and he came straight to the kitchen where she was doing the washing up after supper, and told her immediately, before he'd even taken his coat off, that 7 ranchers had committed to a joint legal response, and the Mendoza family was prepared to testify. Prescott thinks Holt may withdraw rather than face a coordinated action, he said. He's built his strategy on isolating people. This is the opposite of that. Good, she said. He was looking at her with that full, open expression he'd been allowing himself more of lately. You built that, he said. You built that, she said firmly. You're the one who walked into that room and made the case. Ruth. There it was again, her name in his voice, and she turned from the washing up to face him properly. You have to stop being so careful about taking credit for things, he said. It was almost gentle. It was definitely direct. I'm not comfortable being credited for other people's courage, she said. And you won't let anyone give you anything, he said. I've noticed. She went very still. What do you mean? He paused, clearly choosing his words with the precision he used for everything. Henry told me, he said. She stared at him. About the candles, he said. The silence was immense. She was holding a dish and she set it down very carefully because her hands had gone strange. He told me weeks ago, Alfred said quietly. He came to me one evening and said he'd been leaving candles in your room because he thought you might be afraid of the dark and that you'd never said thank you or stop, and he wanted to know if he should keep doing it. A pause. I told him to keep doing it. She could not speak for a moment. He said he thought you needed it but that you wouldn't ask, Alfred said. He said, Pa, she never says a word about it, she just lets them burn. He held her gaze. He's 7 years old, Ruth. And he saw something in you that I've been watching from a respectful distance for 4 months. What is that? She managed. That you are very, very good at taking care of things, he said, and very poor at being taken care of. She felt something crack in her chest. Not the sharp crack of the first night with the candle, something deeper and wider, something structural. I don't need, she started. That's not what I said, he said quietly. I didn't say need, I said that you won't let anyone. She was looking at the wall just past his shoulder because looking directly at him was more than she could manage. My husband, she said and stopped, started again. Thomas was not unkind. But he was not attentive in the ways that cost something. And after he died, I think I concluded that being visible, being someone who wanted things, being someone who could be seen to have lacks, was dangerous. It came out more honestly than she had planned. She heard it in the air and couldn't take it back. Alfred was quiet for a moment. I had 4 years with Margaret, he said. It was the first time he had said his wife's name in her presence. She died quickly. Fever came on fast. Nothing to be done. And I have spent 2 years being so careful about the gap she left that I have done the children and myself a disservice by trying to hold still in it. You've done well by your children, she said. Barely, he said. They were managing. James was carrying weight no boy that age should carry. Clara was drowning in her mother's memory. Henry was so quiet I was afraid of what was in the silence. He paused. And then you came. She looked at him then because she could not. And the house breathed again, he said simply. And I realized that what I had taken for dignity in my grief was mostly just fear. She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something enormous and complicated in her chest. I am very afraid, she admitted, of what happens if I let myself have something and it goes. Yes, he said. I know exactly what that is. I know you do, she said. They were standing in the kitchen with the washing up half done and the lamp turned low and the whole weight of everything they hadn't said suspended between them. And she was aware of him as she had been aware of him for months, the solid reality of him, the honest, careful, unperforming quality of him that had been dismantling her walls one brick at a time without even seeming to try. He took one step toward her, not sudden, very deliberate. The kind of movement that gave her every opportunity to step back. She did not step back. I would very much like, he said, in his careful, precise way, if you would allow me to court you properly. She looked at him for a long moment. A frontier man in a working kitchen asking a question with formal, old-fashioned dignity and meaning every syllable of it. I am employed in your household, she said. Yes, he said, which is a complication I am aware of and intend to resolve. You can't dismiss me, she said. I wasn't planning to dismiss you. What were you planning? to ask you to be something other than my housekeeper," he said. "Eventually, if you were willing." "Eventually," she said. "I'm not a man who does things quickly," he said, "but I'm also not a man who is dishonest about what he wants." She looked at him for a long, long moment. At the honest, weathered face, the careful gray-blue eyes, the hands that fixed things and showed up and did not perform tenderness but exercised it daily in every practical way. At the man who had told his 7-year-old son to keep leaving the candles. "All right," she said, "you may court me." Something moved in his face, vast and quiet and not quite contained. He nodded once. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I am difficult." "I've noticed," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in that now familiar way. "I like difficult things. They're usually worth the patience." She looked away before the fullness of what she was feeling became entirely visible. "The dishes," she said. He picked up the towel hanging on the hook by the sink and started drying what she washed, standing beside her at the basin, not touching, not crowding, simply there, and they finished the washing up in a silence that was the warmest silence she had ever stood in. Spring came to the Cielo Rojo with extraordinary color, the desert blooming after a wet winter with wildflowers in colors she had not expected. Pinks and yellows and deep purples spread across the ground as far as she could see from the front porch. She stood there one morning with her coffee and looked at it and felt, with a clarity that was almost alarming, the particular sensation of being present in a moment rather than enduring it. Alfred stood beside her. He had started doing this, appearing at the times when she was briefly still, occupying the space beside her with a comfort that had become so natural she sometimes didn't register that it had not always been there. "We should get the answer from Prescott soon," she said. "Tomorrow or the day after," he agreed. Holt had, as Nathan Prescott had predicted, reconsidered his approach in the face of the coordinated response. There had been 2 months of legal back and forth, letters and responses and formal hearings, and then a period of silence that Prescott interpreted as Holt looking for an exit. The irregular bank fees had been identified and returned. The land claim in the northeast corner had been withdrawn. Holt had not made another personal approach. "James thinks Holt will target someone else," Alfred said. "James is probably right," she said. "He's a smart boy." "He thinks highly of you," Alfred said. He paused. "They all do." She was quiet for a moment. "Henry," she said, "does he know that I know about the candles?" "Yes." Alfred was quiet for a moment. "I told him you knew and that you were grateful," he said. He thought about it very seriously and then said he was going to keep doing it anyway. She felt the smile before she was aware of making it. "Good," she said. "He also informed me," Alfred said with that carefully suppressed quality that was his version of dry humor, "that he thought you and I would get along if we tried." She looked at him. "Did he say that exactly? In those words? He has opinions." "He has very clear eyes for a 7-year-old, she said. "He has his mother's eyes," Alfred said. It was simple and honest and not painful in the way it might once have been. She saw things clearly, too. She looked at the flowers spread across the desert floor. "She must have been wonderful," she said. "She was," he said. "And she is gone, and I have not stopped loving her or stopped living, and I think that is how it should be." A pause. "I don't believe a person's heart is a single-use vessel." She turned to look at him. He was watching the landscape, but he was feeling her gaze and waiting for her response. "No," she said softly. "I don't believe that either." He turned then and looked at her, and the spring light was on his face and the honest, open expression was there, all of it, not a bit of it hidden. "Ruth," he said. "Yes," she said, because she already knew, because he had been building toward something for weeks and she had been building toward the same thing from the other direction. "I love you," he said, simple as a fact, direct as everything else about him. "I didn't intend to say it this morning, but I don't have any ability to be dishonest about what's true." She stood still for a moment. The coffee was warm in her hands. The flowers were extraordinary in the morning light. Inside the house she could hear Daniel dropping something and Clara's sharp comment in response and the brief, distant sound of Henry's voice, probably defending Daniel. "I love you," she said. And she meant it in the complete way, the way that had nothing to do with convenience or survival or the fact that she was in his house and had nowhere else to be, but with the exact, accurate weight of what she had been feeling for months, which was that this man, this quiet, honest, patient, real man, had gotten through every wall she had built with nothing more than consistent, unperforming goodness. He took her hand. His was large and warm and were roughened, and hers was small and cold from the morning, and he held it with a gentleness that was slightly startling coming from hands that large. They stood on the porch and looked at the flowers, and her hand was in his, and neither of them said anything else for quite some time, and it was entirely sufficient. The letter from Nathan Prescott came the following day, as Alfred had predicted, and it contained the conclusion of the Holt matter. Gerald Holt had reached a formal agreement with the Cattlemen's Association, withdrawing all pending claims, returning all irregular fees with interest, and effectively abandoning his consolidation strategy in the valley. Prescott noted that the coordinated response and the quality of the documentary evidence had made any other outcome untenable. He complimented Alfred's preparation, and notably mentioned that the correspondence he had received from the ranch had been among the clearest and most strategically useful he had dealt with in a decade of frontier law. Alfred read this aloud at the supper table. He got to the relevant compliment and looked directly at Ruth, who was serving the beans. "Mrs. Yates drafted most of that correspondence," he said, to his children, to all of them. "We know," said James, with a 15-year-old's world-weary tone. "She's the most competent person on this property." "I resent that on behalf of the horses," Daniel said. "The horses are very competent," Henry said gravely, and that broke something open and they were all laughing, all of them around the table, and Ruth was laughing too. And it was the kind of moment that engraves itself in a person's memory, clear and golden, something you can go back to. Alfred was looking at her across the table with that full, open expression that she now knew he kept for her, and she looked back, and James noticed, and Clara noticed, and Daniel was already talking about something else because Daniel was always talking about something else. Henry, small and solemn at the corner of the table, caught her eye and gave her a look that was absolutely, unmistakably satisfied. She inclined her head to him slightly. He inclined his back very seriously. The understanding between them, the one that had been conducted entirely in candles and silence, needed no additional words. April brought the formal change that Alfred had mentioned, resolved as he resolved everything, methodically and with complete sincerity. He spoke to her one evening after dinner with the children elsewhere and asked her, properly, formally, and at considerable length, to marry him. He laid out the situation with typical Alfred Fletcher thoroughness. He loved her. He believed she loved him. He was aware of the differences in their circumstances and the complications of the household arrangement and the fact that she had lost one marriage that had not served her well, and he wanted her to know that he understood each of these things and was committed to a different outcome with his whole character. She let him finish. "Yes," she said. He stopped. "Alfred, yes, I will marry you." "I have more points to cover," he said. "You can cover them after," she said. He looked at her for a moment and then smiled, the full smile, the one that transformed the landscape of his face completely, and she thought she would never get entirely accustomed to it, and that this was an excellent thing. He had a ring that had been his grandmother's, a small gold band with a dark red stone, and he put it on her finger with a careful, deliberate tenderness that made her throat tight. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They told the children the next morning at breakfast. Daniel erupted in immediate enthusiasm. Clara was very still for a moment, and then she said carefully, "Does this mean you'll stay?" And Ruth understood exactly what was underneath the question. "Yes," she said. "This means I will stay," Clara nodded. She looked at her plate for a moment, then she said, "Good. Someone needs to keep this house from falling apart," which was, from Clara, an absolutely extravagant endorsement. James shook Alfred's hand with an adult gravity and told Ruth, formally, that he was glad, and she thought he might be the only 15-year-old in the New Mexico territory who could deliver that line without it being awkward. Henry said nothing. He looked at Ruth for a moment with those gray-blue eyes, and then he came around the table and leaned against her in the way that children do, a simple weight of trust, and she put her arm around him and said quietly, "Thank you." He understood. He nodded once, small and serious. She had been carrying the gratitude for the candles for months, all the nights of small gold light in her dark room, all the kindness delivered in silence by a 7-year-old who had seen what she needed without being told. She had never thanked him because she hadn't known how, and also because to thank him would have broken something in the ritual, some private understanding between them. But now she could say it. Now the walls were down. Now she had nothing left to hide. "You knew," she said to him, still quietly, still so only he could hear. "You had a sad face," he said with the simple accuracy of childhood, "when the lights went out." "Not anymore," she told him. He looked at her with the absolute level seriousness of a child making an assessment. "No," he agreed. "Not anymore." They were married in May at the small Catholic church in Mesilla, which Ruth was not but Alfred was, and she had said it didn't matter as long as she had the thing itself, the ceremony, the public declaration, the made fact of it. She wore a dress she had made herself, soft gray-blue wool with white at the collar, the color of the sky that matched his eyes, though she did not admit this to anyone. Clara had pressed it. Daniel had polished everyone's shoes the night before with an earnestness that moved her enormously. James stood beside his father. Henry sat in the pew and watched the whole proceedings with the expression of a person whose plan had come together. It had, she thought, looking at him over Alfred's shoulder during the ceremony. It had really very much come together. Nathan Prescott attended, having made the trip from Las Cruces, and several of the ranchers from the Cattlemen's Association, and the Mendoza family, Rodrigo and his wife and 3 children who were the same ages as Alfred's. Rodrigo shook Alfred's hand with an emotion that was not entirely contained, and told Ruth she was a remarkable woman, which she deflected by saying she had simply noticed some numbers, and Rodrigo said with great feeling, "The right numbers at the right time," which was, she supposed, a fair description of it. The summer that followed was the richest season of her life. She does not say this without understanding. She knew what she had lost. She carried Thomas, not with guilt but with the clear-eyed honesty she had learned from Alfred, the person she had been in that marriage and what it had cost her and what it had taught her. She carried the 3 years of careful nothing that had been her armor. She was not ashamed of any of it. It had brought her here. Here was the kitchen at Cielo Rojo in the early morning with the desert light coming in the window and Alfred's coffee cup on the table where he'd set it before going to check the stock. The sound of Daniel in the yard, talking to the horses with the same elaborate enthusiasm he brought to everything. Clara's voice, clear and precise, correcting her younger brothers on something. James's steady footsteps on the stairs, already thinking about the day's work. And Henry, appearing each morning in the kitchen doorway with his gray-blue eyes and his father's face, and that quality of deep, watchful intelligence that had been the first thing to reach her in this house, the first crack in the nothing. She had, she realized, fallen a little in love with the whole household before she had named what she felt for Alfred specifically. She had been held by all of them, by their various ways of needing and giving, and by the time she understood what she felt for him, it was already so intertwined with what she felt for them that there was no separating it. This is how she would tell it if she ever told it, which she mostly did not. But she held it clearly. They had between them found a rhythm that felt nothing like what she had known with Thomas, which had been 2 people moving in parallel, polite and functional, and everything like what she imagined it could be between 2 people who were genuinely interested in each other. Alfred told her things. He told her about the ranch, the land, the decisions he was weighing, not because he needed her to solve them, but because he wanted to think with her present. She told him things too, slowly, in pieces, the way trust is built, layer by layer, until she had told him most of what there was to tell about Abilene and Thomas and the years of careful nothing. And each time she told him something difficult, he received it with the same quality of attention, complete and calm, and not requiring her to be anything other than exactly what she was. She had not known, going into a second marriage, that it could feel like this. Like a large and well-lit room that she was allowed to inhabit fully. October of 1884, 14 months after she had first come to Cielo Rojo, she told Alfred she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen. She had discovered that she told him most important things in the kitchen, which was the room they occupied most honestly, doing ordinary things, where the directness of their daily life made directness about everything else possible. He was quiet for a moment that felt very long. Then he said, "Are you well?" "Yes," she said. "Are you frightened?" She considered it honestly. "Some," she admitted. "It is not something I have experience with." "I will be here," he said, "every part of it." "I know," she said. And she did know. This was the thing about Alfred Fletcher, the deep, reliable truth of him. He said what he intended and he did what he said, without drama or self-congratulation, simply with the steady, unhurried commitment that was his essential nature. He came to her then in the kitchen and held her for a moment, not speaking, just his arms around her and his warmth and the solidity of him, and she put her face against his shoulder and let herself be held. Henry, she thought. She was going to have to be the one to tell Henry. She told him that afternoon, the two of them in the kitchen garden, where he had taken to helping her with the fall planting in the afternoons after school. He was 8 now, still solemn, still that particular kind of clear-eyed that made her think he always saw more than he indicated. She knelt in the dirt beside him and told him he was going to have a new brother or sister. He thought about it. When? He asked. Spring, she said. He thought about this too, with the methodical interiority she had come to love in him. Will it change things? He asked. She knew what he meant. He meant, will you be different with it than you are with us? He meant, will we still be enough? It will add things, she said carefully, not replace them. He looked at her with those eyes. Do you promise, he said, not a child's whine? A sincere question, asked because he had learned, somewhere in the losses of his young life, to ask sincere questions when they mattered. I promise, she said. He nodded in that way of his that meant he was filing information. Then he went back to planting, and after a moment she went back to planting beside him, and that was that. The winter of 1884 was good. The ranch had recovered its financial stability with the consolidated banking arrangement and the resolution of the Holt situation. The cattle had done well through fall roundup. James, 16 now and unmistakably a man in most of the ways that counted, was taking on a genuine partner's role in the ranch operations, and Alfred was teaching him with the same patience he brought to everything. Clara turned 13 and had a birthday dinner that was the most elaborate meal Ruth had yet produced at Cielo Rojo, and Clara had looked at the table set with the good dishes they'd found in a trunk in the storeroom, dishes that had been Margaret's, which Ruth had cleaned and brought out because they were beautiful, and because she had long since understood that honoring the past and living in the present were not competing projects. And Clara's face had done something complicated and then settled into something grateful. Daniel, 12 and incandescent, decided he wanted to be a lawyer. He announced this at supper one evening and then looked at Ruth for confirmation that this was possible. Nathan Prescott was your age once, she said. He did not begin his life as a lawyer. Was he brilliant? I have no idea, she said, but he was determined. That's usually more useful. I am also determined, Daniel said with absolute conviction. Then you'll manage, she told him. She was aware in all of this of the extraordinary nature of ordinary life. This was what she had not had before, not with Thomas, not in Abilene. The texture of daily life as something rich in itself, the accumulated detail of small moments, the children growing, Alfred steady beside her, the ranch in its rhythms, the desert through every window and every season. She had thought in the boarding house in Abilene that nothing had become permanent in her. She had been wrong. It had simply been waiting for a container. The baby arrived in April of 1885, a boy, born in the bedroom with the help of the midwife from Messilla and Alfred, who had stayed as he promised and been entirely calm throughout in a way she found both infuriating in the moments of difficulty and deeply steadying overall. The boy was solid and dark-haired and very loud about his arrival in the world. They named him William for Alfred's father. Henry was the first of the children to see him by his own preference, and he had stood by the bed and looked at William with that level, assessing gaze, and then said very quietly, "He has your nose." "He has Alfred's nose," Ruth said. Henry looked more carefully. "A little of both," he decided, and nodded approvingly, and that was Henry's welcome of his youngest brother. William grew into a cheerful, obstreperous infant who demanded attention from everyone on the ranch with excellent results. Daniel adored him with the enthusiasm of a boy who had been the entertained, rather than the entertainer. Clara held him with a careful tenderness that told Ruth more about what Clara had needed in her own childhood than anything else could have. James carried him on his shoulder with the comfort of someone who had already helped raise 3 younger siblings, and found a 4th essentially unremarkable in the best possible way. And Henry sat with William with the same quality of attentiveness he brought to everything, talking to the baby quietly as if they were having a genuine conversation, and Ruth would watch from the doorway and feel something so complete it was almost hard to name. She named it finally one evening in the autumn of 1885, sitting on the porch with Alfred in the dusk, William asleep in the house and the older children at various tasks, and the desert going gold and purple in the setting sun. She named it, "This is enough, more than enough. This is exactly what life is supposed to be." She said none of this aloud. She didn't need to. Alfred took her hand, the same way he had taken it on the spring morning with the wildflowers, and held it in the warm, certain grip of a man who intended to be exactly where he was. "The Henderson parcel came up for sale," he said. "The North Piece. It would add a good 40 acres of grazing land. Can we manage it financially? If the Messilla Bank will extend a modest note, I think they will." "Then yes," she said, "buy it." He was quiet for a moment. "You know I am going to continue asking your opinion on everything," he said. "I know," she said. "I have given up resisting it." "Good," he said. "It would have been a losing battle anyway." She looked at him. He was watching the sunset with the quiet attention he gave to everything worth watching, and the light was on his face, and he was, she thought, the most honest person she had ever known, honest in his grief and his love and his stubbornness and his careful, deliberate way of moving through the world. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair, brief and warm. They sat like that as the desert light went from gold to rose to the deep purple of evening, and the stars came out one by one over the New Mexico territory, and from inside the house came the sound of Daniel's voice, raised in some elaborate story, and Clara's sharp rejoinder, and Henry's quiet, steadying intervention. And William, from somewhere deep in the house, gave a sudden happy squawk that meant he'd woken and was ready to be attended to. Alfred started to rise, and Ruth put a hand on his arm. "I'll go," she said. "You're sure?" "In a moment," she said. She wanted one more minute of the desert evening, one more breath of the cold, clear air that smelled of sage and distance. She wanted to sit here in the full weight of what had become her life, and know it completely before she went back inside to the warmth and the noise, and the particular wonderful chaos of a house full of people who needed things, and were not afraid to need them anymore. She thought of the candles. She thought of Henry, 7 years old, going down the hall each night with his small, certain hands, and his tin holder and his match, never asking, never being thanked, never stopping. She thought of how many walls she had built and how quietly and without any announcement this whole household had simply come through them, one small act of care at a time. She thought of Alfred saying, "I know what it is," and James with the coffee cup, and Clara with the wildflower, and Daniel with his endless, cheerful need to be heard, which was, she understood now, a kind of trust. She had come here with nothing but her competence and her silence and her locked room full of things she couldn't examine. She was leaving nothing of that behind. She had simply built more rooms. She stood up from the porch chair and smoothed her dress and went inside to her boy, her youngest, the loud and opinionated new person who had arrived in this house with all his needs absolutely unashamed. And she lifted him from his cradle, and he stopped squawking and looked at her with his enormous dark eyes, and she held him in the warm kitchen of a house that was hers in every way that mattered. She realized, completely at home. Henry appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later, looking for a glass of water or possibly just checking in his way on the state of things. "He all right?" Henry asked. "He's fine," she said. "Just awake." Henry came into the kitchen and got his water and stood for a moment, watching her with William. "Ruth," he said. She looked at him. He was 8 years old and would be 9 in January, growing fast, his father's face and his mother's eyes, and she loved him with a specificity and completeness that she hadn't known you could love a child who wasn't yours but was yours in every way that residence and time and small gold flames in the dark could make something yours. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those gray-blue eyes, assessing, measuring, seeing through things the way he always had. "Good," he said, just that, just the one word. She knew exactly what he meant. He put his water glass in the basin and went back upstairs, and she stood in the kitchen of Cielo Rojo with William in her arms and the lamp burning and her family in all the warm rooms of the house around her, and she was unafraid of the dark, and she had been for some time, and she thought, good. Good, too. Exactly right. She was no longer a woman who needed to say nothing and receive nothing and be careful not to want things. She was Ruth Fletcher, née Yates, of Cielo Rojo Ranch, outside Mesilla, in the New Mexico Territory, wife, mother, keeper of accounts and kitchen gardens and growing boys and one particularly sharp girl in a household that had reached through her silence when she could not reach through it herself. She had arrived on a Tuesday stage with a single bag and no expectation except survival. She was staying forever. The candles still appeared some nights, even now, not from need. Henry was a boy of routine and intention, and he had decided somewhere along the way that the candle on the windowsill in the evening was simply something he did, part of the household's fabric, like checking the stock and reading at supper and Daniel's perpetual theorizing. He left it without ceremony, without expectation, and Ruth, on the nights she saw it, let it burn until it went out on its own. She never said a word about it to anyone. She didn't need to. Some things are understood completely between people who have learned to see each other in the dark, and the words would only have diminished what the silence held perfectly. Alfred Fletcher's youngest had seen her first, clearly and without hesitation, in the way that children sometimes see what adults are too defended to acknowledge. He had left her a small light each night without being asked and without being thanked and without stopping, and that small repeated act of pure, unassuming care had been the first thread of the rope that had pulled her back. She was pulled all the way back now. She was fully here. She was home. The desert stretched away in all directions beyond the walls of Cielo Rojo, vast and indifferent and beautiful. And inside the house the lamp burned and the fire burned and all the people she loved were in it. And Ruth Fletcher stood in her kitchen and held her youngest boy and was not afraid of anything.